Good afternoon. My name is Richard Thornton. I'm giving a brief presentation today about Audacity at Chancellorsville, also known as Jackson's flank attack. We're going to set the scene. May 1st of 1863. You're a member of Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps Army of the Potomac. You're probably a German immigrant. Your morale is lower than most of the Army of the Potomac. You haven't been tested in battle yet. Discipline's kind of lacking. You joined up under General Franz Sigel, the previous commander of the 11th Corps. You're not real happy about your situation. But here you are, you're on the line, you're on the extreme eastern flank of the Army of the Potomac at a place called Chancellorsville, Virginia. It's about 5:15 in the evening, you're sitting around campfire, watching your dinner cook in the bean pot over the fire. Some friends of yours are off in the distance playing cards, writing letters home, telling jokes. Some are playing harmonicas, fiddles, singing, missing their families. Somebody says, hey, look, there are a couple rabbits. And you're looking and you see these rabbits run through your camp. Yeah, that's kind of interesting, you think to yourself, but you don't pay it much mind. And you're sitting there, you're on the fire, and you're hot because it's been 70 all day. The humidity's pretty high, it rained several days prior. You got your blouse off, you're just waiting for your dinner to finish up so you can eat dinner and go stretch out, wait for the sun to finish going down below the tree line, cool off the evening, and you'll start your day again tomorrow. As you're poking at the fire, you notice a couple squirrels run past your camp, and you're like, well, that's interesting. A couple more rabbits and larger animals begin to come after you, skunks and possums and deer eventually and birds. And you're really kind of confused as to why all these animals are running through your camp. And you start looking around, your friends also start taking notice of all these animals coming through your camp and just not really sure what to make of it. But then off in the distance you hear what sounds to be like a coyote or a dog yelping or yipping, or a kind of scream at sometimes. It's a little unnerving, but the noise begins to get louder and louder and louder and louder and closer. And you realize that these animals aren't running for no reason. They're being driven. They're being herded through your camp. But what could possibly drive an entire forest worth of animals through an occupied military camp? As you turn and you look over your shoulder at the sound of that dog's yelping and that screaming sound getting louder and closer, you realize the animals were terrified of what was coming. And now that you can see it, you're also terrified. So May 1st, 1863, Chancellorsville, Virginia. Two men, Major General Joseph Hooker and General Robert E. Lee, will meet on the field of battle. Hooker has not yet met Lee as a commander of the Army of the Potomac. He was given the command of the Army of the Potomac in spring of 1863 following the disaster at Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1862, December of, where General Ambrose Burnside squandered the advantage that the numerical superiority that the Union Army had over the Confederate forces. Lee will be encamped in Fredericksburg, facing off against the Federals who are across the river in Fredericksburg and back towards D.C. But Lincoln puts Hooker in charge, and he says, you know, General Hooker, we need somebody who's going to take the fight to Lee. And so Hooker makes a grand plan. He knows that Robert E. Lee is still hanging out in Fredericksburg, Virginia along the Rappahannock River, and he decides he's going to take the entire Army of Potomac, all 134,000 men. He's going to make a grand sweep around behind Robert E. Lee, come up, pin him against the river, crush him, defeat the Army of the Northern Virginia, turn, march on Richmond, end the war by summertime. Everything is great. The Union's restored. He's the hero. Lincoln's proud. Maybe go into politics afterwards. A couple things stood in the way of General Hooker. One was Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. His combat-hardened troops were not ready to give up the war yet. The second thing is a guy named Thomas Jonathan Jackson, better known as Stonewall Jackson, Lee's chief lieutenant and second in command. And the other thing that would get in Hooker's way was Hooker himself and his confidence in himself under fire. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Slide, please. So starting off the battle, General Hooker had 134,000 soldiers. 28,000 of them, roughly, were stationed at Fredericksburg, opposite the Rappahannock River on the eastern flank, on the eastern bank of the Rappahannock, and they were facing off against 10,000 Confederates under Jubal Early. Now Lee had told General Early, I need you to stay here and demonstrate against the Federals. Make yourself seem as large as possible. Build campfires. March your men back and forth between the trees so they can see glimpses of lots of troops moving. Make yourself appear to be huge. And that should tie up the 28,000 Federals in Fredericksburg long enough for us to handle anything that comes our way. What was coming his way were 106,000 men under Major General Joseph Hooker. Hooker's belief was that he can get around behind Bobby Lee, pin him against this river. Well, unfortunately, Hooker was discovered by a guy named Jeb Stuart, who was Lee's cavalry commander. Okay, the flamboyant Virginian rode up to Lee and said, General, the Federals are crossing the Rappahannock and the Rapidan rivers above us, and they are attempting to get to our rear. Lee decides that can't happen, so he dispatches 50,000 Confederates under himself and General Jackson, and they start marching west. Slide, please. On May 1st, so here we have Fredericksburg, Virginia. We have the Federals under General Sedgwick and Reynolds, opposite General Early's troops. Again, 10,000 Confederates, 28,000 Federals. Lee has taken himself and Jackson and begin to march west down the road here. They are going to meet up with the advance party for the Federals under Generals Geary, Williams, Sykes, and Slocum's Corps. And they're going to have a small but sharp battle here just west of the Zone Church. Now, Hooker's belief was that after the debacle at Fredericksburg, he could convince Lee to fight him in a defensive battle. He would do exactly to Lee what Lee had done at Fredericksburg. He is going to attempt to line up in a line with his flank anchored against the Rappahannock River and way far out here, so there's no way that Lee can get around him. He's going to fight this defensive battle. He's got his men digging in. They're digging trenches. They're putting up fighting positions. They're building fences. They're hiding behind these rocks. And he's going to invite Lee to attack him on the ground of his choosing. Well, Lee knew that was going to be a foolish thing. He's outnumbered almost 2 to 1. Again, 104,000, 50,000 roughly. So after a sharp fight here, the 12th Corps just west of Zone Church with Anderson, Rhodes, and McLaws, Hooker decides to take his men and pull them back. He will pull back into a line just north of Chancellorsville. This little area here is called Chancellorsville. It was nothing more than a hotel, roadside hotel, small inn run by the Chancellor family. That was Hooker's headquarters for the battle. Once he pulls these units back, he will have sealed his fate. Later that evening, as Lee and Jackson decide how are we going to do this? How are we going to defeat a numerically superior force? Jackson and Lee are going to meet here just west of Salem Church, and they're going to have what has become known as the Cracker Box Conference. It was so named because Jackson and Lee turned over a couple of cracker boxes, sat down, and discussed what the plan was going to be. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the actual site on May 1st of 1863, where Jackson and Lee met underneath these trees. You see an artist rendering up here in the corner where Jackson and Lee are discussing. This will be the last time that Lee and Jackson ever saw each other. Now, a couple things to know about Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Extremely religious man, very fervent, prayed daily. He did not choose to fight on a Sunday. However, if it was God's will, he would do it, and he would believe that God would kind of be on his side because it was a holy day. He prayed constantly, prayed before battle, during battle, after battle, prayed while he was assessing his enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Also, Jackson had blue eyes, intense, light, penetrating blue eyes. His soldiers would often call him Old Blue Light, and the light came from the light of battle. When Jackson went into battle, his eyes lit up. And one of the officers, actually General Robert E. Lee's nephew, Fitzhugh Lee, would talk about Jackson's eyes. Slide, please. This is a picture of the road, the actual road that General Jackson took with his troops the following day during his flank attack. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this road is about 4 people wide. So if you take 4 grown men and you put them shoulder to shoulder, that's about as wide as that entire road is. And I want you to keep in mind, because the next slide is going to show you the route these men took down this actual road, across this creek, which was the last drink of water the Confederates would have before they marched into battle. Slide, please. Here's a picture of Old Blue Light himself. Now, General Fitzhugh Lee was a cavalry officer in the Army of Northern Virginia and the nephew of Robert Lee. He said his eyes burned with a brilliant glow, lighting up a sad face. His expression was one of intense interest. His face was colored slightly with the paint of approaching battle and radiant success of his flank movement. That kind of really sums up what Jackson was thinking. And what they were talking about, this flank movement, when Jackson and Lee met there under those trees, and Jackson and Lee were looking at this hastily drawn map, and General Lee proposed, could we flank them? Is it possible? And Jackson said, well, it just so happens, General Lee, I have a guy in my unit here who is from the area. He knows that there is an unfinished road, the one we just saw, that leads around to the extreme western flank of the Army of the Potomac. That flank is out there in the air, is what they call it, anchored to nothing. No rivers, no terrain features, nothing. It's just hanging out, and that would be Aldro Howard's 11th Corps. So General Lee tells Jackson, he goes, can you make this flank movement? Can you do this? And Jackson says, well, certainly. Absolutely, General, no problem. And Lee looks at me and says, well, General Jackson, with what force do you propose to make this maneuver? Jackson looks at Lee with his intense blue eyes, Starting to get that flicker of battle. And he says, well, General, with my entire corps. An entire corps for General Jackson was 28,000 Confederates. General Jackson looked at General Lee. General Lee looked at Jackson. Lee said, make it so. They shook hands. General Jackson departed for his camp. Now, once this flank maneuver is done, and after the battle is done, and history progresses, Fitzhugh Lee would go ahead and he would comment in his memoirs about the moment that Jackson saw the flank of the Army of the Potomac. And he said, to the remarks made that the unconscious line of blue was pointed out, he did not reply once during the 5 minutes he was on that hill. And yet his lips were moving. From what I have read and heard of Jackson since that day, I know now what he was doing then. Oh, beware of rashness, General Hooker. Stonewall Jackson is praying in full view and in rear of your right flank. Stonewall Jackson, looking at the enemy and praying, almost became a talisman for his men. Some people believe that God actually listened to Jackson when he prayed. There were times he should not have won. This will be one of them. But for whatever reason, Jackson prevailed. So Jackson praying in full view of the rear of your right rear flank, bad day and bad things were going to happen to whomever he was looking at. Slide, please. So that morning, after Jackson and Lee had met the night before, Jackson comes back and he tells his men what they're going to do. They start off, and they're going to follow this red line. They're going to go down the plank road. This red line that wraps all the way around, it's about 12 miles distance. Again, remembering that road is about 4 individuals wide. It is not paved. It is dirt. It is muddy. It has been raining several days prior. That would actually work in Jackson's favor. To march 28,000 men down a dirt road typically would raise a large cloud of dust. However, thanks to Virginia rains, their movements went largely undetected. There were some times that they were spied by the Union, and you can see that here with Sickles and Slocum. Little breaks in the trees, they would see Confederates moving. Well, the Union would tell General Howard up there to the north, and they say, General, we've got Confederates moving to our front, that we must do something. Well, General Howard was pretty lackadaisical. He's like, surely not. We are so far out here, not going to happen. And Jackson also surprised the Confederates by turning south here, making General Howard and subsequently General Hooker believe the Confederates were leaving. We see their backs, they're walking away. Ha ha, we have won. We've chased old Robert E. Lee from the field. Well, unfortunately, that was not the case. General Jackson had taken his men here at Catherine's Furnace down the Furnace Road and come up the other side across by the Orange Plank Road. Now, there's a dashed line here. This was Jackson's original plan, was to come down the Plank Road and attack the front of General Howard's lines. He was persuaded, however, to go just a little farther towards the Wilderness Tavern, up to the Orange Turnpike, and come fully on the right flank. Now, you have to understand what the terrain is here. We're talking the wilderness. Large trees, very difficult, thick underbrush. Artillery isn't going to be a huge factor in this fight. There are some clearings where it can work, but overall, this is going to be man on man, musket to musket, bayonet to bayonet, hand to hand combat in these woods. And that would again work to Jackson's favor. So as Jackson lines his 28,000 men up in a line of battle, Generals Rhodes, Colston, and Hill lined up in a line of battle from end to end, approximately 2 miles long. 28,000 men stand in the bushes. It's 5:30 at night. Jackson rides up to General Rhodes and looks down and says, General, are your men in position? General Rhodes nods. Jackson says, you may move forward. And 28,000 Confederates step out of the bush. One step. There's no sound. It's still. The humidity in the air masks a lot of the sound, a lot of the jingling of equipment. And the men begin marching slowly. Their bayonets are fixed, gleaming in the last little bits of Virginia sunlight as evening approaches. As they begin their move across this red arrow here, you might wonder why the Federals couldn't see them coming. Well, if you've ever been to Chancellorsville, there is a little bit of undulation in the terrain. And when Jackson stepped out, the Federals were hidden behind small rises in the ground. They really couldn't see what was coming. And so the first inkling that something was amiss were the forest critters running through the camp. The rabbits, the squirrels, the skunks, the deer, the birds. That's what was driving these animals, 28,000 Confederates. And as they moved, they began picking up speed. And they started giving out what became known as a rebel yell, a yip or a howl or a banshee scream. And the Union soldiers, they heard this, they turned and they're sitting on their camp stools and their shirt sleeves, their rifles are stacked. They see a wall of gray 2 miles long. It overlaps them by a mile on each side. They can do nothing except stand up, try to fight, or run away. Because the 11th Corps was very new, unbattle tested, many ran away, just out of sheer terror. A few did try to stand and fight. However, because of Jackson's audacity in taking half of an numerically inferior army, marching them 12 miles down a cow path, lining up and marching into battle in the evening time, Jackson's 28,000 men would drive the 11th Corps from the field. They would be totally ineffective and would not be heard from again until July of 1863, when they faced off against Jackson's Corps at Gettysburg. Subsequently, after Jackson's success, he would come to this point here where it would get dark. Men would start to mingle up. Divisions would get very, very mixed and confused. It's hard to control men, especially in that era, Napoleonic tactics. So Jackson called a general halt, and he rode forward to check out the lines. He wanted to continue this attack at night. He wanted to maintain that momentum and crush the Army of the Potomac, rescuing his country from federal invasion. Unfortunately, as Jackson got right about here, troops from North Carolina, the 18th North Carolina, heard horses in the woods. They figured it was the Federal Cavalry Patrol, so they leveled their muskets and they fired a volley of 58 caliber mini balls into the oncoming cavalry, which actually turned out to be General Jackson and his entourage in a recon party. Stonewall Jackson was hit 3 times. He would subsequently lose his left arm. As he was being taken back to his line, an artillery shell fired by the Federals would land near the litter, would knock him and his entourage off the litter. Jackson would contract pneumonia and die on May 10th, 1863. Lee would be told what happened to Jackson about his amputation, and Lee would remark with just a mournful cry that he may have lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. That's how important Jackson was. After the flank attack, command of the 2nd Corps would default to General Jeb Stuart. The attack would be successful. Chancellorsville would go on to be a resounding Confederate victory. It would be called Lee's Perfect Battle. But because General Robert E. Lee, instead of General Stonewall Jackson, divided a numerically inferior army not once but twice in the face of superior numbers, and they took the advantages given to them by General Hooker, by the terrain, by the weather, and by the sheer will of their men to fight, they were able to turn certain defeat into an absolutely stunning, stunning victory. And that is the description of the audacity at Chancellorsville and Jackson's flank attack. Thank you.